right, good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. My name is Vanessa Silk. I'm an attorney with Baird Holm Law Firm, and I'm the Vice President for the Nebraska Water Resources Association. So we welcome you here this morning for our October Roundtable. We've had a few months off over the summer, so welcome back. For those of you who don't know, NWRA is a nonprofit alliance of state organizations and individuals dedicated to appropriate management of water resources in the state of Nebraska. We have stakeholders from just about every facet of water management in the state, and we work hard to identify how we can better educate folks on water issues, and this roundtable is one of those examples. So thank you for coming. This morning, just a few housekeeping items. We have our sign-in sheet. I think in past sessions we passed it around. We're just going to set it over there by the coffee and donuts. I'm pretty sure each of you are going to hit the coffee and donuts at some point, so please look at the sign-in sheet and make sure you update your contact info. We do have a new association management company, Capital Management, here, and they have taken over all of our management issues and communication to folks that participate on water roundtables. So make sure that you have your updated contact info. You want to make sure you stay on the list. As you can see, we are recording the presentation this morning. Those typically are posted on YouTube within a week.
Okay. We'll get it.
We're still transitioning things with these folks. The video presentation will cover everything this morning up until the question and answer session. That will not be posted online. So feel free to ask any questions you want. We also have our convention information, the joint convention that we have with NSIA. The brochures for that are right over by the sign-in sheet as well. So this morning we have Glenn Johnson and Don Kraus as our speakers. They're going to give us an update on NWRA's policies and different ideas for the upcoming session and the upcoming year, what we're going to focus on. Glenn Johnson, most of you know, recently retired after over 44 years with the Lower Platte South NRD. The Lower Platte South NRD has been a regional leader and cooperative force on a variety of water, conservation, environmental, and recreational issues under Glenn's leadership. So we're happy to have Glenn here to give us an update on NWRA issues. Don Kraus got his bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. He is currently the general manager for the Central Nebraska Public Power and Irrigation District. They're responsible for delivering irrigation water to more than 100,000 acres of land in south central Nebraska. So again, we're happy to have Don and Glenn here for that. At the conclusion of their presentation, Lee Orton is here, and I understand you're going to give us an overview of the Leadership Academy, Water Leaders Academy?
A little bit, yep.
Great. So we can answer questions on that as well. The last item before I hand this off is our next Water Roundtable. That will be Wednesday, November 9th at 8 a.m., actually at 9 a.m. in this same location. So make sure your contact info is updated.
9 a.m.
9 a.m.?
Did I put
8 a.m.?
8 a.m.
Great, thank you guys.
Sorry.
November 9th at 8 a.m. Really nice. All right, it's time for me to hand it off. All right, Glenn and Don. All of you.
Okay. Thank you, Vanessa. I'll start off, and as Vanessa indicated, Glenn and I are going to give a little update on some of the activities of NWRA, National Water Resources Association. And I'm going to start with 4 topics: waters of the U.S., drought legislation, ESA, and more specifically compensatory mitigation and water smart. And before I go, I want to mention a few things. NWRA does a strategic plan every year, do an update, but as a part of that, they've got a little, here's what we've been doing, and I thought it would be good just to give a little summary from that. In January of 14, there have been 15 comments submitted to Congress, 21 pieces of legislation supported, and they met with dozens of congressional and committee staff as well as agency representatives. 7 NWRA witnesses provided congressional testimony, held 4 congressional briefings on the Hill, and met with a number of other staffers. So this is just a little bit of background on some of the things that NWRA typically gets involved with. 4 areas that they've been active in the last 3 or 4 years. Waters of the U.S. is one of them. You're all fairly familiar with that, at least at some level. Clean Water Act, Section 404, establishes a program to regulate discharges of dredged and fill material into wetlands. If there is and so what happened is EPA issued new guidance information on what is going to be the criteria for establishing a wetland or waters of the U.S., if you want to be specific, because that is what would trigger that activity and requirements on a 404 permit. They started that process in 2014, and a second process was begun in 15, another draft guidance document. Again, thousands of comments submitted on this is an expansion of requirements, additional restrictions on activities. But nonetheless, in August of 15, the guidance was approved, or excuse me, noticed in summer of 15, became effective in August of 15. So in October of 15, the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals issued a stay. So that's currently in place. You have this new guidance, stayed, and essentially the activity is in the courts. I mean, that's essentially the current status. However, there was a lot of activity prior to that, organized with NWRA to submit comments to EPA during those two hearing. Thousands and thousands of comments went in. However, it is as we say in the court system, and we're hopeful there is some positive there, but some people are saying that it's going to end up in the Supreme Court, and so then you've got another set of numbers that may not look good depending upon how the Supreme Court selections and replacements go. So nonetheless, NWRA has been very active on representing constituents on that matter. Secondly, drought legislation. This legislation is primarily focused on California as a result of their ongoing drought out there. Bills from both the Senate and House have been introduced. In the House, Representative David Valadao from California has introduced the H.R. 2898, Western Water and American Food Security Act of 2015. In the Senate, two bills, Senator Feinstein, Senator Flake from Arizona. NWRA provided testimony on all bills. Currently, the Valadao bill is attached to an energy bill that is kind of stuck. And in the Senate, there's also an energy bill, but it has different drought language. So at this time, it is very unclear on how that is going to move forward, if at all. Little progress is expected until the elections is over, is probably the summation of that. Endangered Species Act. NWRA has been active on two areas, reform of ESA and responding to new initiatives. And I think it might be good just to do a little bit of background on ESA and what that is all about. Some of you are very familiar, but others say, I understand it, but U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service must evaluate whether a federal action is likely to jeopardize the existence of any listed species, or whether that federal action would adversely modify critical habitat. So the key words there are federal action. And so to the extent there is a federal action, that automatically triggers ESA. In the case of Central NPPD on their FERC licenses, that triggers that federal action and requires consultation with Fish and Wildlife Service. So those are some examples of how ESA affects folks within Nebraska. But then what happens next is there is an evaluation. Is that going to, an action going to jeopardize or adversely modify critical habitat? If jeopardy or adverse modification exists, in the opinion of Fish and Wildlife Service, then there is a reasonable and prudent alternative that must be developed to avoid that jeopardy. Fish and Wildlife now believes, as a result of a presidential directive or presidential memo which recommended compensatory mitigation. Now this is a little more, one way to describe it is this is a landscape approach in lieu of a project-by-project approach to mitigation for ESA. And it's not real clear how this would work out, but what is clear is what the direction they're going. They have issued a notice, federal notice. Here's this new policy. Fish and Wildlife has issued this new policy. And we have this process of commenting. NWRA is working with NESARC, National Endangered Species Act Reform Coalition, to develop comments to evaluate that potential policy and what those impacts could be, and then provide comments. So that is the current state of affairs. Those comments are due with October 17th, so it's coming up really quickly. But it's fairly complex. It kind of gets into this concept of taking a landscape approach and superseding that on their, when they go through their consultation. And to say how that plays out is not clear to me, but it is certainly a change in the status quo. And at least from some legal folks, it is there's no statutory basis for that, so that is some of the concerns. All right, so we are, NWRA is actively trying to represent constituents on that matter. Lastly, WaterSmart. Many of you are familiar with the WaterSmart program. The Bureau of Reclamation established the WaterSmart program to achieve a sustainable water management strategy to meet the nation's water needs. Funding is provided on an annual basis through a competitive grant process. And the reclamation is seeking comments on draft evaluation criteria for 3 categories in the WaterSmart program. Water and energy efficiency grants, small-scale water efficiency projects, and cooperative watershed management program. So kind of complicated, and I'll give you some examples of what each of these might be. The water and energy efficiency grants. There's going to be a new emphasis on projects that dedicate water for in-stream flows. So and there's going to be a separate funding opportunity for water marketing. Some of the criteria they've identified, what are the quantifiable water savings, water sustainability benefits, and that's where they point directly at in-stream flows and how that potential savings gets transferred to in-stream flows. So there'll be money available for those kind of projects. Now that's not unusual. We have those kinds of things going on within the state of Nebraska. We have retirements of some surface water irrigation activities that have been and those waters are being transferred to in-stream flows. So there is some of that kind of activity going on within NRDs, within irrigation districts. So there is some of that activity out there right now. Other criteria, is there an energy water nexus? What are some of the adaptation strategies? How would it affect or involve future on-farm irrigation improvements? And typically, you'll have funding of up to 50%. So one of the comments we've thought about is at least letting them know that if you're going to look at some of these transfers to in-stream flow, make sure that it is consistent with state laws. In other words, these have to be, even though there is maybe this federal grant program to the Bureau, it should recognize and respect state laws. That's one of our comments. But then, nonetheless, that's one general area where they're requesting or changing criteria and requesting comments. Secondly, small-scale water efficiency projects. Examples would be canal lining, municipal metering, irrigation flow measurement, SCADA, landscape irrigation, and high-efficiency indoor appliances. $150,000 maximum per project. You have an overall cap of $2 million, and there are some that are pushing and saying that should go higher. So we'll see, where some of those comments go. Lastly, a cooperative watershed management program, and they're seeking collaborative solutions to water management issues. They're seeking and requesting comments on the criteria. Up to 50% cost share. Examples would be improving stream channels, restoration of floodplains, restoring riparian vegetation, about that one. Invasive species control and prevention and control. And so this is invasive species control. That's something that caught my eye. We've got a number of activities, across the state where we're looking at fighting phragmites, looking at those kind of problems that occur with encroachment of these invasive species. And so I think it is an area that we should, obviously push more for funding and support. And certainly we are doing those activities across the state right now. Comments are due October 28th on all of those categories. So these are just a few examples of some of the activities that NWRA gets involved in and on behalf of members across the 17 western states, provide comments on those and try to represent the risk and interests. So with that, I will stop and turn it over to Glenn Johnson.
Thanks, Tom. Topics I'm going to talk about are Water Resources Development Act, or WRDA, the implementation of the Food Safety Modernization Act, groundwater, and a couple other topics on just NWRA administration and upcoming political appointees and what's going on there. One of the pieces of legislation that actually has been moving through Congress this year is the Water Resources Development Act. Both the House and Senate have approved Water Resource Development Act bills, and they are scheduled for conference. The conference, Senate and House members have not yet been appointed to that conference committee, but the staffs are working on that. The Water Resource Development Act, if you don't know, is the vehicle which is the authorizing legislation for Corps of Engineer projects across the country. Whether they're navigation, whether they're flood control, whether they're environmental restoration, they would have to be included within that Water Resource Development Act. It has to go through that act and be authorized before you can start the appropriations process and actually put money towards it. The last Water Resource Development Act was passed in 2014. The intent for Congress is to get back to a every 2 years, have another authorizing bill come through. In addition to specifically including projects, identified projects, it also includes a lot of policy discussion for Corps of Engineer. And so there's a lot of that in this bill too. They're passed with very overwhelming numbers. The Senate bill was passed 95, 3 and 2, and the House was 399, 25 and 7. There's a difference certainly in the authorization levels. The Senate bill is a lot larger, both in terms of number of pages, but also in the complexity of it, a lot more stuff packed into it, and more projects. One of the processes for getting a project included in the Water Resource Development Act, that whole act had tough going for a number of years after the earmark ban was put in place. There really wasn't any agreed upon process of how you were going to get bills. You couldn't mention a project by name. Your Senate or your House member couldn't come up with it and say, we want this project. So it took quite a few years before they settled on a process which basically kicked back to the administration really the responsibility for putting projects into the Water Resources Development Act legislation. But kind of there's a little process where congressmen can suggest projects in their district that they think are ready to go, and but they can't push for them. But there's a way that they can in the background kind of let be known that these are favored projects to the administration. Well, then the administration reviews those, that being the Corps of Engineer headquarters. Congress did set some criteria for what they have to meet to be able to put in there. One of the criteria is if they're going to move forward for implementation, they have to have a chief's report, which is chief of the engineers. So it's had to go through all of the planning process, and the Corps signed off on it, and then they can go ahead and basically name the project in the Water Resource Development Act. This year, this particular act, there are no projects in Nebraska this time around. There has been in every other Water Resource Development Act either a project for implementation, for construction, or modification, or just starting the planning on the process. Back in 2000, in the 2000 there were 3 Nebraska projects that were included. It was the Antelope Valley Project, the Western Sarpy Clear Creek Project along the Platte River down by Camp Ashland, and then the Sand Creek Project, or Lake Wanahoo, up in the Wahoo area. And all 3 of those projects have been now completed. There are other projects in Nebraska, but none of them are quite in a, they've either been included in WRDA or they're not quite ready yet to be pushed forward in the next WRDA bill. So it is important for Nebraska because that's the only way you're going to get those kinds of projects. One of the additional things that it really got a lot of the discussion in Congress on WRDA was drinking water this time around. There's always been a small water supply component and in the Water Resource Development Act and core projects. There's a lot of core reservoirs that are primary storage water supply. Get out to Texas, and a lot of their water supply for their communities is coming from Corps of Engineer built reservoirs. In this case, it's been a little bit more focused on water quality and kind of focused in on lead contamination, and even the House bill narrowly focuses in on Flint, Michigan. And so there's quite a bit of language in there on different ways of assistance that the Corps can provide, and that'll end up being applicable to the whole country, including Nebraska if it gets expanded beyond just Flint. Some of the program reforms are pretty interesting because they really include flexibility that the Corps hasn't had in the past, working with local sponsors and how the cost-sharing arrangement works. One of the problems in the past has been the Corps has to have an appropriation first before they can do anything, even if the project's already been approved, it's halfway under construction. If the Corps doesn't get an annual appropriation, and that's the only way appropriations work, the Corps doesn't they get authorization for the whole project, but then the money comes only in annual increments. And if Congress doesn't appropriate any money that year, that project doesn't go anywhere in the past. This new language would allow basically the local sponsor, if their money is available for their share of the cost, and it's usually a 60-40 split in most of the projects, the Corps hasn't been able to go ahead and use the sponsor's money to keep moving on the project. We got caught in that for 5 years on the Western Sarpy Clear Creek project. We just couldn't move. Well, that's one of the changes, that they would allow now the sponsor's money to be used by the Corps and to continue to move the project forward. So that's one of the flexibility things. The others deal with if you are going to have a project that's been damaged by either a flooding disaster or some other type of, or just needs rehabilitation. There is an opportunity now to go in, and the local sponsors can, if it's feasible, upgrade that project, increase capacity storage, increase the level of flood protection. using local sponsor funds jointly with the Corps. So that's a pretty significant change that would come in that act. So we're watching that bill pretty closely at NWRA. Only recently has NWRA really gotten involved in the Corps of Engineer issues, and they've focused primarily on Bureau of Reclamation issues prior to that time. But a lot more of the western states have Corps projects. The Corps has been taking a more prominent role in rules and regulations, and so it's become much more important to have them on their agenda. And one of the changes in staffing at the Water Strategies, which is the company that manages the National Water Resources Association, is they just added onto their staff part-time Steve Stockton. Steve just stepped down, retired as the Director of Civil Works at headquarters at the Corps of Engineers. And those of us who worked with the Corps in Nebraska know Steve Stockton, and he'll be a tremendous asset to that association. That's a real good capture for them of that expertise. Let me talk about the implementation of the Food Safety Modernization Act. That's a real concern to the western states, particularly those that are really heavily into the vegetables and fruits for both animal and human consumption. This was signed into law in 2011, and the final rule was published in 2015, so now it's getting ready to be pushed forward in implementation. The intent of that is to take the focus away from responding to contaminated food products to prevention of contamination in the field, in the practices, in the process, in the transportation, in the storage, in the processing. So it provides some intervention steps, I guess, if you will, and controls and requirements in all of those earlier steps. Where NWRA's members particularly come into play is the requirements on the agricultural water that's used to irrigate these particular crops, and the requirements for water quality sampling and monitoring, recording, documenting. It's pretty extensive. So they're working through that process now, trying to find ways to streamline that process. How does it impact Nebraska? Obviously it doesn't impact corn, soybeans, that type. And there are others that are exempt, but there probably is some produce grown in Nebraska that it may well affect. And who knows where it will go from here once they start implementing it. But it doesn't affect products grown for personal or on-farm consumption. If that product will receive an immediate commercial processing that will remove any microorganism contamination possibility, that's exempt then too. And some of the other products are what they call the rarely consumed list. That's Great Northern beans, pinto beans, sugar beets, sweet corn, potatoes. Those are all products in Nebraska that would be impacted if they weren't exempted. But any vegetable crops, those type of things, may likely be exempted. So that's one that they're certainly looking at. It also addresses biological soil amendments. So, and if you have animals, wild or domestic, in the area that also could provide contaminants. So there's a lot of different regulations on that. Groundwater, not any real legislation at all at the federal level dealing with groundwater at this point. rules sometimes get in there. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service did propose to issue a directive on groundwater management on U.S. Forest Service lands, but that was withdrawn in 2015. But they say it's going to come back, but it would, a lot of concern over how that would impact and interfere or interact with state groundwater regulations and authorities. So that one's on the big watch list. There is a presidential memorandum directed at all the federal agencies to build capabilities in this drought resilience, and obviously that's going to bring groundwater into it also. That's just really getting started, and we don't know for sure where that's going to go, but again, and Don mentioned that, so we're looking at that. There is a lawsuit that's just been filed, and it's on the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court now, which they have titled as the first interstate groundwater case, Mississippi versus Tennessee. Apparently, there's some sensitivity of some wells, municipality in Memphis pumping, and Tennessee says that water's coming out from underneath us and drawing our wells down. So it has moved to the Supreme Court, so we'll see what will happen there. The first complaint on that was filed in 2005. Congress is out now. They'll return November 14th for a lame duck session. That's after the election. So what gets on their agenda and what actually gets attention will probably depend a lot on how the election outcome is. The break for Thanksgiving and the return in December. Obviously, one major item of business they do have to take care of is budget for 2017. They've got a continuing resolution, which I think goes through December 9th. And the talk is either extending that continuing resolution just into the new year, extending it for the whole rest of 2017, or coming up with an omnibus bill, rolling everything together and coming and adopting that. So we'll see where they go with that. One of the major changes we're going to see that will be watched very closely by NWRA is in the Senate is the Environment and Public Works Committee. Senators Inhofe and Barbara Boxer have been co-teaming on that committee since 2007, and obviously they're fairly far apart on their positions of things, but it has been an interesting committee, and both of them will be, for certain, Boxer stepping down. Inhofe is, under the Republican rules, is term limited as chair of that committee. So we'll see what happens and see who's going in there. There's been a number of names thrown around, but I think the election is going to determine a lot of that. But that will change the whole dynamics of that committee, I'm sure. EPA, Corps, most of those major issues on the Senate that we're, NWRA looks at, go through that committee. The final thing I'll mention is the other thing NWRA is just starting to work on is, again, following that election coming up after the first of the year, there'll be a lot of changes in all the departments as far as the department heads and several tiers down in there. And obviously probably not a whole lot of influence on who the Secretary of Interior is going to be, but maybe the undersecretaries and some of those positions, the second and third tier political appointees, So NWRA is working with some other like-minded groups back in DC to try and come up with some names and candidates to put forth to the new presidential administrators on those appointments. So with that, I think Don and I would open it up for whatever questions you might have.